So I'm gonna break a little bit from conventions here. I don't know if I'm breaking from conventions a little bit. This the kind of the introduction to JavaScript and how JavaScript works portion. It's also going to be the creating elements portion, like lecture. That's going to be both those things. As mentioned before, my preference here is that, and like my teaching style for this course is going to be, I'm going to be teaching you JavaScript as we go through it. So rather than teaching you all like the basics of like what a function is up front, I'm going to be teaching you in chunks as we use it to modify the DOM. That being said, there are a few things I do want to dive into right away. There is a new README in this repo if you're keeping along with the code at home. It's Introduction to JavaScript. This comes directly from the curriculum that Flatiron gives me. I disagree with some of it. Like this, first off, history of JavaScript, I got into that yesterday or on Tuesday, so we don't need to talk about. We don't need to talk about reviewing the request response cycle yet because I think we're already. I'm waiting for Fetch to do that, and then it goes right into passed by value versus passed by reference, which is a thing that I, and more importantly, Dan Abramoff, the co-creator of Redux, someone who's really associated with React, he works at Facebook, thinks is a dumb way to describe JavaScript. So I'm going to ignore a lot of this, but I want to talk a little bit about what a function is, and what it means when people go like, when they talk about how most things in JavaScript are objects, including like functions are objects. That like makes no sense to people right out of the box, especially when you're like, okay, but what's an object? So I'm going to talk really quickly about the data types that we have in JavaScript. There's a bunch that you should know that are the primitive data types. So string is one of them. Oops. Oh no. String, number, Boolean, null, undefined, and symbol. You're noticing not a number is not on here. If we go over here, can we get not a number? Because not a number is a number. Thank you, JavaScript. But we don't have to think about that too hard because I'm sure our brains will melt. But we got symbol, undefined, null, Boolean, number, and string. These ones I kind of expect you to be largely familiar with. We know what a number is. We know that when we're typing words and we don't want them to be variables, we should wrap them in quotes. That's what a number, string, that's what we're talking about there. Symbol, we're not going to be using that for a little bit, but we use it in Ruby a lot. Booleans, true or false. And then null and undefined, which makes sense. So there's more digging into that if you want to like actually click around the README. But I kind of want to get right to objects. Cool. So objects, you're going to think a lot like hashes in Ruby, and you won't be wrong. They're a lot like hashes with a little bit more versatility than like the hashes that we have in Ruby, and that we can just store whatever we want in them. So like an obvious way to create an object, we could have like const Batman or const big object equals all the things I arbitrarily type in class. And then we can even do something like let's give it a log. Cool. So I've got this big object, right? And it's got a string that I can get from Batman right here. We've got cheese right here. What happens if I call log? If I just type .log right here?
I think it does like a weird like F symbol and doesn't print anything out because it needs an argument, right?
Yep. It tells me that, hey, this is a function. Specifically, it's a function that does this, right? But now if I want to like go ahead and I want to say hi, right? Suddenly it returns hi, right? Or it doesn't return hi, it returns undefined. It prints hi. That's a very different thing. We'll talk a little about return statements later. So everyone comfortable with this idea of an object where it's just like something we can just store things on, right? And then start calling key value pairs on them. Yeah, what's up?
I have a question. Like, say that you had two instances of big object. Like you wanted, like how do you initiate like a different instance of big object in this?
So you're asking how do I like have a big object instance rather than a big object like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get to object orientation later, right? Like we can always have like we can define classes in JavaScript. You'd be like obj, right? And then this is just going to be for the people who have gone through this before, but we could be like constructor obj, right? This is going to be annoying. There's a couple of other things we can do here. But what I can now do, right? Be like new obj. Then we can go ahead and pass in big object, right? That's eventually going to be kind of class syntax. We're going to discuss that way later. Like I'm going to discuss way earlier than most people do. But it is something we can do, right? Eventually we're going to be using class syntax to make a lot of our lives easier, right? Because they're a really useful way to organize reusable bits of code. When we go to object orientation versus just a vanilla plain old JavaScript object, right? That's going to be two different things. When I say like object oriented like stuff, right? We're going to be defining classes that have different behaviors and store different data, right? And we're going to use that as a way to compartmentalize our code and make our code like keep track of itself and use itself better. For those of you who have gone through the program before, I will give you hints for like how we can like talk about that. And I'll kind of like throw out like, hey, this would be a cool opportunity to refactor into class or like into object orientation. But when I say POJO or an object in JavaScript, what I mean is just a curly boy with some stuff in it. So object orientation refers to like classes and class syntax and stuff like that. A plain old JavaScript object or a POJO is what I'm going to be calling it, is just something that we store a bunch of keys and values in. Cool. So weird thing though, if I have a function that I'm just going to call cheese exclaimer. Let's start with this, right? We can call console.dir on it and see all of its properties, right? You'll see that it's a function. It's got no arguments right now. We don't know who's calling it. Some other weird stuff. Here's its name, right? And then it's it's going to do some other stuff, right? Prototypes we'll get to way later. But this is a function, right? If I call it, oops. What'll it return if I put parentheses next to it?
Cheese?
So it'll print cheese. It'll return undefined, which we'll get to in a second. The very big difference, right? Now console.dir works on basically anything, right? Let's call it on big object. you can notice, hey, the prototype is a vanilla object. It's got like some cool functions about it. We've got this .log that we can call. We've also got Batman and cheese, right? So it returns undefined and prints cheese. This is going to be really important. This is going to be the next thing I'm going to drill into, remembering to return stuff, right? If I decide, hey, I want to rewrite this and I want to say return Manchego, right? Now, if I call this, what's going to happen?
It'll print cheese and return Manchego.
Yeah. This becomes important if I want to do some weird stuff, right? What's this going to do?
Print cheese and then return Manchego is my favorite kind of cheese.
Exactly right. Cool. So
Do
Yeah, go ahead.
functions by default return strings without the keyword, or do you always have to say return?
Functions will not return unless you tell them to return. This is one difference between Ruby and JavaScript, right? If I go into Ruby, right, we can go. I'm going to open up IRB, right? You'll notice, despite the fact that I don't have a return statement here, it implicitly returns the last line. Puts, however, will return nil or undefined in Ruby. So if I just like rewrote this, we get undefined method plus for nil class, like a normal language would do, right? Where cheese is going to return undefined, right? Or nil. And then it's going to like add that to is my favorite kind of cheese, right? But the important thing in Ruby, we didn't have to put return statements in our code. In JavaScript, if you want your function to return something, until we get single line arrow functions, which I'm going to show you a while from now, you always need a return statement. So if I did this without a return statement, right? We would get undefined is my favorite kind of cheese. Now you'll notice, right? It didn't throw an error here. It just made undefined is my favorite kind of cheese. This is what I mean when JavaScript will stab you in the back right here. It just let this happen. It went ahead and tried its best. So when we're doing stuff, remember, it's like Samin Nosrat tells you always be tasting while you're cooking. Always be console logging when you're coding. Test each of your return statements. Test that everything's showing up the way you want it to. But like important note here. Everything that happens before the return statement is still code that can run, right? Like you can go here and instead of just console logging cheese, right? You could have this change something on the DOM. You can do whatever you want inside this function. If you want a function to return something, you've got to write return. And this is going to bite students, like the two big mistakes that students make in the stuff that I've just taught you, and you will make this mistake tons because also non-students make this. Forgetting to return something is one really common failure. You'll be like, hey, this function isn't giving me what I want. And it's because you didn't write return in front of it. That's a very common thing that happens. Second is, so we did this one. Second one, I'm blanking on right now. Why? I just had both of them. I'm gonna walk that one back. This is gonna come back to me in a second. But remembering to return something, super important. If you want to like actually use the function and use what it evaluates to. Yeah. So right here, really built up for a list of two things and I still can't figure it out. A couple of other things I want to show you, right? So we can have like a function, right? Cheese exclaimer. We can use like a set timeout. Right? And we're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to like create a function here first. And notice I'm just creating a function inside of another function. And go ahead and I can be like, wait 5 seconds and then run this function cheese, right? So notice I'm passing in a function definition. That was the second thing. Invocation versus defining a function. Parentheses. Knowing when to and when not to put parentheses is important. So the big question here, oops, let's do this one more time. It's gonna return 1. So first off, what do people think is going to happen here?
After you hit enter or after you run it, it'll go wait 5 seconds, say cheese, and then return 1. Or yeah, cheese on the console, and then we'll return 1.
I'm saying, yeah, we'll see this. We actually get 2, and then cheese 5 seconds later. I'm actually illuminating a couple of different concepts right now. JavaScript is asynchronous. If it sees something that tells you to wait 5 seconds, then do something, it'll remember to wait 5 seconds, but it'll go on to its next step. It's not like sleep in Ruby where you have to wait and then it runs. What I'm doing right here is I'm defining a function called cheese. I'm passing it into the set timeout. Then I'm returning 1, and then I'm adding 1 to 1, right? So we know that the return statement of cheese exclaimer is going to be 1. That's not the hardest thing to figure out here. We have this return 1 right here. So anything we invoke, it's going to return 1. Can anyone tell me why I have parentheses here, but not here? And what would happen if I did put parentheses in the set timeout?
Because you're calling a function
Yeah, this one. Go
on
ahead.
the you're calling a function which is the one that you're adding, but you're also returning the previous one before. That is why it's returning to 2. It's adding 1 plus 1 and returning 2.
Yeah. So we're calling this function, which we know is going to return 1, right? With here, we're calling the function. What are we doing here? We're not calling the function. You're exactly right there.
Is this a calling versus invoking thing?
So I,
Functions behavior here. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. What we're doing here, right? We're calling a function or we're invoking that function. Here we're just passing that function in. We're we've defined this function cheese and we're being like, here is that function. Don't call it, here it is, right? When we don't use parentheses, what we're doing is, hey, here you go. Use this when you need it, right? This allows us to do weird stuff. I'm going to show you like the weirdest example of this in a second. Before I do, I mentioned that functions are objects. Everything in JavaScript is an object. I wasn't lying about that. I'm going to go to cheese exclaimer. I'm going to say dot favorite equals Gouda. Cheese exclaimer still runs the same way. Cheese exclaimer now has a thing called favorite. Oops. You can just arbitrarily start treating anything you want in JavaScript as long as it's not a primitive type, like it's an object. You can start giving it keys and values. You can start using those. You quickly run into the Jurassic Park rule. Does anyone know what the Jurassic Park rule is?
Is it when he said something like they were so obsessed if they could do it, they didn't stop to think if they should?
Bingo. JavaScript, coding JavaScript, rule 1, code on the Jurassic Park rule. Ask whether or not you should. Does it make sense for this function to hold the state of your app? Probably not, unless you're doing some weird JavaScripty stuff. But you can feel free to just start putting keys and values on functions if you want. You can do that anywhere you want. That's why we say functions are objects. But sometimes first off, it's helpful to be able to return functions. It's helpful to be able to do other weird stuff. For example, I'm going to create this function. Let's see if I can do this right. I'm defining a function that takes in a greeting, right? And in here, I am going to return a function an anonymous function that I'm not naming. I could name it if we want to. Let's do a little string interpolation here. This might be a cool first step right here. If anyone, this is not something I'm expecting to have an answer, but can anyone tell me what I would write here to use this to say hello, Nikki? Or let's use Esperanto. Welcome in, Nikki.
Can I take a guess?
Sure.
Would it be, yeah, greet, parenthesis, or greet, parenthesis, hello, close parenthesis, dot, person, parenthesis, Nikki.
Not
Close-
quite.
Uh,
Dot person is not, if we console dot dir greet. We actually don't have this dot person function inside of it. It's not in the directory. It's defined locally, but it's not expecting that you should be able to call it outside of the function. This is going to be weird. The other ones also good try, everyone who posted stuff in the console, right? We know what greet hello returns. It returns a function. So, there we go. Will Goldman. Is that how you any Esperanto speakers here there to correct my spelling? What the heck happened here?
Let's see, after greet. After the greeting, then you've got hello in there, and then it is requiring another function. So you just gave it another argument right after that.
Yeah. So what greet Willkommen returns a function of person, right? That weirdly keeps track of greeting, right? So what I did here, when I said Willkommen, it goes ahead, takes this in, returns this function of person with the console log with greeting already defined. This is weird. When you understand this, you understand a lot of how JavaScript weirdness happens. A more simple example. Bless you.
Thanks.
That's just console log. How do I get say na 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 na?
Just called Batman?
Put 2 parentheses.
Yeah. Weird, right? Batman gets invoked, returns this function, right? This anonymous function. Then we invoke that. We can have some fun here, right? We can go ahead and rewrite this a little bit. I'm going to do this and then explain it later. Oh, whoops. No. So this invoking it once will return the function, and then 5 seconds later say Batman. If I do this twice, you get na 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 na, and then Batman. That's a really good question. Try it again. Oops, there we go. Cool. If I call this, will we get na 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 Batman, or ladies and gentlemen, how do we kill the Batman? George is right.
No, because it's the return, right?
The return is how it knows, right? So if we have multiple functions within that function, right? It's only the return statement that decides which. I don't want to say the second argument, the second invocation will go to, right? Because any function, right? Or any function that has a return statement, whenever it sees parentheses, it evaluates it in place, turns it into its return statement, and then prints it out, right? This becomes important when we go ahead and we say, we can change this a little bit so that it's less confusing now. We're gonna do this the other way around. I'm going to make this let's return this. Cool. Now, yeah, George, you're allowed to just keep doing this indefinitely to the point where this is an annoying little bit of like, if you're planning on like taking a job interview with that would like that goes like JavaScript skills a must. Sometimes they'll try to quiz you on weird JavaScript, right? But returning functions into other functions, I once had to for a practice problem. I don't think it was a real job interview. Had like a 12 function return statement just because they wanted to make it basically work like a calculator. It was really weird. I will show you that eventually, probably if I can dig that up. But like they wanted to make it so that you could be like or like it might have been like it was like some weird sort of way of chaining it. I'll dig this up and then we'll talk about it. But yes, returning functions into other functions is very normal in JavaScript. It's often goofy, right? But right here, I'm going to go ahead and now what do we expect to happen? Oh wait, nope. Yeah, what do we expect to happen here? No guesses? So what's going to happen is it's going to wait 3 seconds, right? Then it's going to console log. No. This is how set timeout works. You hand it a function, and then it runs that function after a given time. Cool. All it's doing right here is we're passing in the function Batman. And so it's console logging. No. It doesn't need to do anything with the return statement, so it doesn't, right? It just ignores it. Console log does this. It gets back a function at the end, but at the end it's done, right? It's done. It's run this function once. It's not going to automatically invoke it again. If I do this though, what'll happen?
You should get Batman right away, and then 3 seconds later, you'll get console log. I think I screwed that up.
You were close, actually. It'll work exactly as I wanted it to. No. Batman, boom. What happens is it invokes it. You're invoking Batman, so it's reading this from left to right, saying set timeout. Oh, I know that function. It's going to take in 2 arguments right here. The first argument, it sees Batman with parentheses. Once it sees those parentheses, it goes, it wants me to invoke this function. So it stops what it's doing, goes into the Batman function, runs the Batman function. Console logs, no, right? Immediately. Then this function returns an anonymous function that console logs Batman when run. And so what is returned into the set timeout is the function, the anonymous function that console logs Batman. And it waits to run that for 3 seconds because that's what set timeout does. Set timeout invokes something after 3 seconds.
So those parentheses after Batman, that means that the set timeout is going to hit that function within the function.
Yeah, it's going to run the function within the function before it even finishes evaluating what set timeout does. And this is the same kind of thing that works in Ruby too. I have no idea what the 6 and 7 get return are, but given that it seems to be incrementing, I'm wondering if for some reason set timeout tells you which set timeout it is. I have no idea why set timeout returns 6 or 7. But it seems like that's what that function will normally return. But what it's doing right here, sees Batman, runs the function, and then uses its return statement, which is how functions work, right? Functions, when even in Ruby, when we used methods, whenever you ran a method, if I went ahead and did like def1, right? 1 end, right? 1 plus 1 is 2, right? I do it's going to print out 2, right? What's happening here is it goes to puts, sees this parentheses, sees 1, goes, oh, that's a method. I have to run this method. Its return statement is 1. I'm going to add 1 to that. And then I'm going to return, like run this put statement once I've evaluated everything inside this parentheses. Cool. This is a big delve into what return statements are, but as long as we're in JavaScript, we really need to know what a function does. And a function has side effects and then a return statement. It does some stuff and then it returns something. Cool. If we want to do this way, function 1, return 1, 1 plus 1. Let's do this, right? Does this 1 plus 1 is, I bet, gonna be weird. Thank you. It's going to actually turn my entire function into a string for some reason, and then tack 1 on it. But 1 plus 1 is going to do this. How are we feeling? Mind blown a little bit, for sure. but this is important. The last thing I'm going to show you, right? There's a case, right, where in set timeout, right? We need to return a function, right? We need to return a function definition. We can't return an invocation, right? So remember earlier, when we would greet, we do welcome and Nikki, right? This function takes in 2 arguments just to run itself, right? Now, if I do set timeout, what'll happen? We'll wait 3 seconds or we'll run immediately.
Wait 3 seconds.
It'll actually run immediately because it sees those parentheses and it runs those. It just does it, right? So suddenly it's going to run that immediately, return undefined here, right? And then 3 seconds later, it's going to do something with that. Greet returns undefined, right? I've confirmed. Let's take a look at where greet is. Yes. Or sorry, person returns undefined. So that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to like happen. So if I wanted to go ahead and like return right. This would be very goofy. Whoops. No, I used the wrong function. Ignore me. Where's my greet? There we go. You can now see that we get welcome and Nikki, and then a little bit later, hello, right? Naomi, what can you give me 30 seconds? I'm going to answer your question. I want to show one thing right here because this becomes important, right? So it's a bummer, right? Like I want to be able to make it say welcome and Nikki after 3 seconds, right? Let's go back to our old version of the function. So how do I get it to take these, to hold on to these arguments, but wait for till 3 seconds to run them? Anyone have an idea?
Put the 3 seconds argument before the greet function.
Not quite, right? That'd be a little weird. The second argument's always going to be the timeout, right? The actual answer here, and this is a very common thing in JavaScript, rather than changing the function, right? Assuming that this function is always going to be like this, a really common thing to do, if you want to be like, hey, I want you to run this function, but with these arguments when you're ready, right? Is to create an anonymous function right here. That's job is to run this function. If you ever want to pass in a function definition, not execute a function, but you want to pass it in with your own custom arguments, creating an anonymous function, right, which is just a function that doesn't have a name, is the way that we do it in JavaScript. Eventually, you'll see this syntax a lot. Which is arrow functions, which I'm going to talk about in a while, right? But all it's doing is basically the same thing. You can even go right here, bloop, bloop, bloop. Cool. What I'm saying is hold on to this new function that I've created that all it does is call my old function with specific arguments. Very common thing to do in JavaScript. We do it all the time. How are we feeling? Annoyed, mostly?
So, like,
Mhm.
if the argument has two, it'll turn immediately. But if you make an anonymous function, it would like takes whatever time it is. It'll take the time or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. So right here, if you make an anonymous function, right here, now suddenly I'm just passing in a function definition. I'm not passing in a function evocation, right? So this works with less complicated examples, right? Let's go back here, right? Instead of greeting Nikki, I'm just going to do something we all know. Console.log hello world. Now it's going to wait 3 seconds and then console log hello world, right? What I'm doing here is I'm making sure that instead of just invoking the function, I'm passing in a new function that's job is to invoke the function. I'll be doing this a lot. For the first 12 times I do it, I'm going to point out exactly what I'm doing. But like there's examples that are like really helpful. Like, hey, let's say I want to use the same function, right? Like I'm actually not going to come up with this yet because there's going to be a lot of analogies that I can't get to. But this right here becomes how we discuss that, like how functions work. There's return statements, which you must have if you want the invoked function to do something, to like spit something out when you finish invoking it, right? So like if you want to make anything happen, usually remember that you probably need to return something. Or not anything happen. There's a lot of situations where you might not care about returning anything. But it's super important to know that if you want that function to put something in the place of it when it's finished invoking, you need to return it. Versus in Ruby where we didn't. Ruby would always return its last line. And then the other thing is just that functions can return other functions. That's the other thing. And then I guess a third thing, anonymous functions are a good way of being like, hey, hold on to this function, but with this argument. Cool. We're going to be doing a lot of this. This is not the only time you're going to see this. But I want to give you all a deep dive into functions before we do anything else. All right. I'm about to get to like coding a website, but I want to like spend some time doing this weird stuff. Do you have any more questions aside from I hate this? How are we all feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. Feel free to use let's just go ahead. Are you kidding me? In order to create a poll, I have to do this. Let's go ahead. I'm gonna do this just once. Thank you. This is way too much effort. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. I'm gonna stop this. I'm gonna stop doing this altogether. The polling feature is Garbo, is my take on Zoom. Cool. Feel free to just spit it out in the chat, whatever. Fair. We're going to get to doing something else. Cool. We're back to cats now, and we're going to stay at cats. I'm sorry. This is not going away for a while. What I'm going to be doing for the next couple days at least is coding out the rest of this fan site. For those of you who are watching, having repeated this phase, I'm not going to be building this the way that your final project is going to be built. Our final project is going to be one page that makes itself look like it's refreshing using JavaScript. Or like that makes you look like you're going to different pages using JavaScript. Anything that we're going to do to change the website will be done with JavaScript. In this case, I'm going to build a couple of different HTML elements though. So right here, I'm going to go back into my index.html, right? I'm going to start working on the second page that I'm going to call cats. So if we want to make a link, right, you can go ahead, ahref equals /cats.html. Cool. I'm going to do the same thing here. Just really get this nav bar up and running. And we're going to be coding like we did back in the old GeoCities days. Great. So now it's mad at me for some reason. Probably because my CSS gets ruined by the anchor tag being on the outside. Just going to go ahead. Do this. Great. Cool. So now if I click home, we go to home.html that doesn't exist because it's index.html. Right. Click here, we go back to index.html. I want to be able to click here, go to cats.html, which for some reason, oh, duh. There we go. Now if we click here, we get no page, right? But we can go ahead and build a new page. I'm just gonna go bloop, cats.html, HTML5, yes, please. Like, and now I can go ahead and I'm just gonna, first off, I'm gonna refresh this, right? Cool, we're back. This is an empty page. I'm going to say, we're gonna make this as GeoCities as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and say, my favorite cats, spelled wrong. And then I'm probably going to do, nice. Yeah, feel free to do that and I will look at, see how everyone's doing. It is okay to still feel uncomfortable with some of the weirdness of functions. There we go. Cool. Now, if we refresh the page, we will see we have my favorite cats, copyright Nikki 2021, do not steal. Very official. I'm going to copy over some of my style sheets or my style sheet. Cool. Great. I'm also going to copy over that nav bar because that was super helpful. Boop, boop, boop. Cool. And now we have our nav bar and we can tab between these. Currently, this doesn't show anything, but we now have a functional website. Cool. All I did there was HTML, right? I went and I had this anchor tag that hops between my index.html and my cats.html. How are people following you so far?
You know, it's easier than Ruby.
Yeah.
It's more
Yeah.
like more like I don't know, more like resume, like it's
Yeah,
not
I
all
mean-
over the place like in Ruby.
Yeah, this is how when you're building a static website, often it seems really overkill to build up a Rails stack for it, right? Rails becomes helpful when you have 30 different pages that you want to have the same nav bar for, and when you want it to be dynamic to have a database, right? This is not dry at all. I've written the same code twice, right? But it works. And we're just coding in raw HTML. It's fine to code a website in raw HTML if you want to do like one or two things. HTML and CSS, that's a website. We don't have to get fancy. We don't have to add React. We don't have to have a live server. But now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to teach you how we can start building stuff on the DOM. So I'm going to start by I have this cats array.js. And all this cats array is going to do for me is going to create a constant called cats that's an array with all of Nikki, my favorite cats, right? We have Bomblerina, McCavity, Skimbleshanks, Grisabella, Mr. Mistopheles, and the Rum Tum Tugger, which I think are my canon favorites. All of them just phenomenal cats, right? And so we have an array of objects here. Before I lose anybody there, we have an array of objects there. We all cool with that?
Yeah, I have a question. Can we put just any kind of pictures? We don't have to put the pictures in the file like with Ruby Rails, because I see that you only use a hyperlink there.
You can actually do this with Ruby and Rails too, right? We can always code in image URL, or we can store an image URL in our database. Eventually, I'm going to be rebuilding this cats thing on a database, probably, if I don't get bored and decide to do a different website. But remember that image can just take in a link to somewhere on the internet. Here, I'm going to go ahead, add a script tag. Source equals cats array.js. Now, those of you thinking, hey, wait a second, we want to defer this or something because we don't want it to run until the page loads. I know for a fact that my cats array does not make use of the DOM. So it doesn't matter where we store this array, right? Like we're not asking it to check for something on the DOM. I'm being like, hey, just load this immediately. It's cool to store this into your database. Or into your, sorry, as a local variable, not into your database. What this is doing, right? Me doing this is the exact same thing as doing this in the console, to the point where it goes, hey, cats has already been declared. But if I refresh the page, I can just call cats right here. And it gives me an array of 7 cats. Cool. This is going to be what we're going to be doing for the rest of this lecture. I'm going to be showing you 2 ways to put this up, to add these cats to your browser. Cool. So I'm going to start by creating a new tag right here. I'm going to call this cats.js. Cool. I'm going to add some dot slashes. Cool. And here I'm going to now create a file called cats.js. The first thing I'm going to do, because I'm a smart developer, is console log hello world. Double check that this loaded. Nice. Cool. We have this file. It works. Who's with me still? Good. All right. Here, I'm going to go ahead. I might as well do this on the console first. There is something you can do. I'm going to start, basically my eventual goal is going to be to have a div, right, called cats list, I think, if I remember my style sheets correctly, that inside of it has a div for each individual cat as a card. So I'm going to first have to create a cats list main div, and then iterate through all of my cats and give them all a card. How are we feeling on that? Does everyone see my vision here? Cool. I think there is a way for you to all like give thumbs ups and thumbs downs if you want to. I don't think you can do a thumb sideways. Can you guys give thumbs downs? Can someone give me a thumbs down if you can give a thumbs down? Because it would be no, you can't give a thumbs down. Cool. Cool. Give me a thumbs up or a no is how we're going to be doing this from now on. Cool. Great. So our goal here. Now let's try this out. Thumbs up if you see what we're trying to do here. We're building a div to hold all of these, and then we're going to iterate through the cats and create individual cards. Cool. Awesome. All right. So first things first. We can always be the laziest we could possibly be. Document .body .inner HTML plus equals /div class equals cats list. Let's make this a string. oops. Oh, right. Cool. Now, if we look at the elements, right, you can actually see there's this div with a class name of cats list. Just going to go ahead. I'm going to copy this into our code. Now that we know that works, I'm going to double check my CSS to make sure that I'm actually doing this correctly. Do I not have a main container div? Great. So I don't need to worry about this at all. This is one of two ways that you can go ahead and create an element in JavaScript. Using inner HTML, you can just tack stuff on. There's two potential problems I'm going to warn you about, right, with this. But before I do, this seems like a very lazy way to do it in comparison to the other way I'm about to show you how to do it. That does not make it bad. Inner HTML is fine to use. It is dangerous to use for two reasons. One, any element that you add to the inner HTML of basically gets replaced with a copy of it. So any event listeners you added to it get deleted. This will eventually become important to you as a developer later on. Two, if you're using user submitted attributes in your inner HTML, it means that your user can run HTML on your code. This is called an XSS attack, which you're not going to be evaluated against by our other teachers, because I don't think all the other teachers know about XSS attacks. But it's a fun way to like go ahead, and I could be like, hey, what you asked me what my name as a user is? My name is image with a source tag that's broken, and then an alt tag that goes ahead and runs an alert that says hack the planet and then deletes your page, right? And then suddenly you have to go into the database and delete that. And when we get to fetch, I'll show you it, because it's fun to run XSS attacks on your friends. The fact that it removes event listeners, and the fact that this isn't like a variable I can call. I can't access this again. The alternative way to do this, right, is to instead do this a little bit more. So first off, I'm going to like start doing like const body. No, I'm not going to do that. That we already have body, I think, right? I'm going to go ahead and say const cats list equals document.create element div. When I do this, you will notice when I refresh the page, there is no, I'm not hiding anything from you. There's no div on the page, despite the fact that I'm making it, Josh, there's going to be so many times when you're going to want to use inner HTML anyways, because it's so much easier, and you will usually be right. I'm going to be using both throughout the program. Usually when I'm sure I don't need to like have an event listener on it, and when I'm sure that I'm not going to be using user submitted attributes, or that I'm not going to be showing it to somebody who would want to hack my app. Because you'll see why. There's just times when it's just like way easier to write code that way. But we can go ahead right now. I'm going to do this create element. And you'll notice still not on the page, right? But now if I go ahead and I do like document.body.append child cats list. If we refresh this page, now we get an error because document.body can't be loaded. Who knows why we can't find document.body here? Exactly. We got to defer this. Boom time. Now that we know that cats is going to use the body, we have to wait for the body to load. And then there we go. Now, if we look at our elements, we've got this div right here. And you'll notice this doesn't even have a class, right? I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna like actually just start running this in the console first. There are two ways, right? Now I have this cats list. I know it's a div, right? I can be like dot inner HTML equals h1. Look at this div, right? I just want to like be able to prove something in the browser that this exists, right? So what I did here was now we have this div and inside is this h1 that says look at this div, right? So we do create a div, right? And because cats list was called by as document.create element, it returned an element that I can just keep track of and I can start adding things to. Inner HTML does not return an element that I can keep using, right? So now I can go ahead and I can start doing stuff to this, right? I can call this class list dot add cats list, right? And then right here, it has a class of cats list. There are a bunch of different ways you can add a class in JavaScript. Class name, you can go ahead and just write cats list container YOLO, right? And then all three of these become different classes on the object, right? But if you want to like use JavaScript's friendly tools right here, you'd be like class_list.add will allow me to add hi right here. Class_list.remove will allow me to remove YOLO because it's 2021. And we're like, if I teach for another 8 years, like people will be like, I was born after YOLO. So here we go. Cats list.class name now does not have YOLO. Can go ahead and remove hi as well. Cool. Going to remove container. It even has this cool little feature, class list.toggle. Cats list. So now if you take a look at cats list, it doesn't have anything on it, but if I call toggle again, it now has something on it. Oh, we're all sorry to Zac Efron for that. That's difficult. But now if you get it, you would seem ironic, which so you can go all the way around on that one. But yeah, so now we have this cats list. Ooh, it did format something. Maybe I didn't notice this in my CSS. So like, let's actually take a look at this right here. Look, it's toggling. You can imagine doing something like set interval, create a function, go ahead, run this. Make it run every 1 second. Yeah. We have fun here in JavaScript. Anyone know how this is happening? My cats list CSS is centered. So when it has a class of cats list, it's going to be centered. When it doesn't, it's going to be left justified. And now I'm just toggling it, whether it has a cats list every 1 second. Fun? And you'll notice I had to create an anonymous function to make sure that toggle was being called with an argument of cats list. This is what I meant earlier when I said this is going to be a really good tool for passing something in with a specific argument. Cool. Going to refresh this. Going to go ahead and redo that over here. Oops. It's going to do classlist.add. I'm going to do document that create element div. I'm going to set that equal to cats list. So I'm creating the elements. I'm giving it some features, right? Yeah. So if you want to see that function again, let's see if I can. What I'm doing is I have the set interval, which runs some, it's like set timeout. Instead of just doing it once, it does it every second, right? So I'm toggling the class that centers it every 1 second. So set interval and set timeout a little bit different. Set interval, do this every 1 second. Set timeout, just do it once. So cats list class list. I didn't mean for that to be that poetic. Sounds like a Shel Silverstein thing. But then the last thing I'm going to do to make this work right now, if I refresh this, we have access to cats list, but it's not on the DOM. I can call cats list. And I'll be like, hey, it's a div. And I'll be like, where is it? And it'll be like, nowhere. You haven't added this yet. But now as soon as I can do like document.body.append child cats list. Cool. And then we get a div with a cats list inside of it. Cool. How are we feeling? Thumbs up, no, or something else to show that you're neutral. Cool. So here we now have a little bit to get started. Remember, we also have this array called cats, right? And I can do like cats.forEach console.log. And that's going to iterate through all of them and console log them. So what's happening here, right? Is this is actually, JavaScript does weird stuff, right? Our for each is going to pass in by default each cat as the first argument to whichever method you pass in here, right? We can be more specific. We can be like, hey, you should give this as a cat. And then I want you to run this new function called console log with this cat, give it an anonymous function. People do this a lot for some reason when you're in JavaScript. A lot of people aren't comfortable with just knowing that it's going to by default pass in a cat as an argument to the function. But notice I can iterate through them, right? And just pass in a new function. And then it's going to pass in each cat to that new function one at a time. How are we feeling on that? Yeah?
Hey, Nikki.
Yeah.
If the console.log was something like set interval where it took two arguments, not set interval in particular, but just something that took two arguments, would the for each pass it as the first argument always, or would you then need to specify that you're passing in a cat and tell it where the cat goes?
So are you asking if for each were to pass in two arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it wouldn't pass in two arguments because it's just iterating through cats and that's the one argument. But could you, if you put like set interval and then the only argument was 3,000, would it know that the first argument of set interval is supposed to be the argument being passed from for each? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it wouldn't, right? In most cases right here, if you're trying to like make it call it with multiple arguments, like if I want to make it like have this is a little bit goofy.
Right, so in this case, you'd have to specify the cat part. You couldn't just do it as if it.
Yeah. That's I think we can go ahead and try. But already here we're passing in. Yeah, I can't think of a way to do it. The question you're asking.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. But let's go ahead. And now that we do this, right? Got 4 each, we can go ahead and append cat. I'm going to write this function, append cat. It takes in the cat and console logs it. Cool. How do we feel about this code right here? Remember that.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be just easier to create the div in the HTML file instead of creating it on the cats.js file?
Yes, if
And-
you knew that it was going to be stationary, yes.
Okay.
You could, the third way you could always do all of this is by going ahead and saying div class equals cats list / div. And this is totally normal. If you're going to have a container div that you know is going to be stationary in your HTML, you should feel free to do so.
Okay, cool.
Eventually, we're going to be coding apps that might show 3 different pages in the same HTML file, in which case it's helpful to have these all functionally oriented. So you can call a function, just print your whole page, right? But this is also kind of insane. If you told the way that I just described it right here, not doing this on the HTML, if you told that to a developer 10 years ago, actually, I want to render out my whole page with JavaScript, they would be like, you're insane, and please stop doing that. But here we are, and we in React land where like you will find that React just has like div class equals root, and that's all of its HTML. And then everything happens when it grabs, or it's like ID equals root. It starts by grabbing this ID or this div and then does all of its coding inside of there.
Okay, great. Thanks.
But here we go. We now, this does the same thing, right? With JavaScript.
I don't know. Maybe I just want to be lazy.
Yeah. And that's often okay. And especially in this situation, very okay. Cool. So then we have this function that appends cat. So it's going to pass in a cat each time, and then it's going to append it, right? Easiest way to solve this problem, right? Cats list dot inner HTML plus equals and then we can go ahead and we can start actually coding this one out. Div class equals card. Did I call it card? Oop. Cat card. There we go. / div. Great. And in here, I'm going to start writing a bunch of stuff. Cool. Now I'm going to run this. Boop. This vaguely works. Did not work as well as I anticipated. Probably because my CSS is wrong. Let's take a look. What did I do here? CSS. Cat card that has a child of image. That's right. Just not making this a p tag. Let's see. Probably wrong. We don't have to worry too much about styling right now. Or is it just that my code is bad? Nope. We'll deal with this in a bit, I think. Cool. This is my old CSS from a year ago. So a little more unfamiliar with it, that's fine. We're here, right? So this easy way to do it, right? Inner HTML, this is why inner HTML still gets used, right? Despite the fact that now if I go right here, if I go to my cats, like imagining that cats array was something that was submitted. Now, if I go like H1 marquee slash marquee, and we reload the page. So imagining a user submitted that. Now we have some weird stuff going on that, like, if I were writing an app for other people to use where they submitted that into a form and then some kid just broke my app and I would have to go to the database and solve it. That's one of the things that inner HTML is not great for, right? So that would be an XSS attack that was a little bit playful, right? But let's go ahead. Let's imagine that that's okay. We now have this bad boy. Why is this not working? I'll stop thinking about it. You know what? I actually do care. I'm going to go ahead and make each cat I don't know. Give it 400 pixels of height, and then we don't have to worry about it. Still a little goofy looking. I don't know what's up. But here we go. Questions about how I got to this situation where we now have a bunch of cats. Okay, let's actually show the cats.js. Do you have any questions about how this one worked?
Hey, Nikki.
Yeah.
So here you're using the inner HTML, which you don't want us to use, or this is recommended? I'm forgetting, sorry, or I'm confused. Should we not use HTML, or is this a different thing here?
So this is there's no situation where I'm going to outright recommend things in JavaScript, or if I do, it'll be warning. This is not recommended. It's not recommended. It's recommended in certain cases. Usually when you're not using a user submittable attribute, and when you know you're not going to be adding event listeners to it, and when you don't care about keeping track of it as a div again.
Got it. Thanks.
And here's why. I'm going to show you this, and then we're going to get a little bit over, right? I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to do it the other way. The other way sucks in this case. It's going to be annoying, and I hate it, but we're going to do it. We're going to do const cat card equals document that creates element div cat card dot inner oh sorry, I'm not going to do inner HTML, and I'm going to move this all down so I can actually see what my previous one looked like. Oop, oop. Great. Cat card dot class list dot add cat card, right? Going to now create going to be like cats list dot append child cat card. So notice right here, cats list is just a global constant, right? For those of you who are further on in the program who have done this before, right? Defining global variables, not great, right? If I want to just for fun do a design pattern that I don't often use, I could create something like const line 12. That was a little while ago. Needs a D for the argument. Which one? Cats list.
Instead of card, it's card.
Yep, nice. Thank you. Cool. I can always do something like dom equals object, right? Instead of this, I can be like dom.classlist equals this. dom.catslist.classlist. Dom. And then you're keeping all of this inside of a neat little object that you can use to keep track of everything. Keep track of everything, right? Where are we losing stuff? All right, we're still good. So for those of you who are thinking about object orientation, right? This is the first step to having a class that keeps track of what's on the DOM for you, or otherwise keeping it in some sort of thing that isn't just globally defined constants. I want you to think about this pattern because we can start doing some cool things with this at the end. So for those of you who are like, what? I'm just passing this in as to the object of DOM instead of just defining it as a global constant. So I'm saying, hey, there's this object called DOM that has a cats list that allows me to just access my cats list. So if I then wanted to like do stuff like remove to it, I don't have to like find it again. But getting a little ahead of ourselves. This is a design pattern that I'm just arbitrarily making up on the spot. It's JavaScript, no rules. But this helps to avoid having a bunch of different global constants like cats list that I might forget that I have, and that might then interact with other things. But now I'm just going to go ahead right here. I'm going to append this child of cat card, and then inside of it, I'm going to start creating some other elements, right? I'm going to be like, hey, I'm going to be like, document.create element. This is really bothering me, the fact that it feels the need to put things the const name. I'm going to do name.inner text equals cat.name. Going to do const image equals document.create element image. Image.source equals cat.image. Image.alt equals cat.name. You're good developers, you'll always include alts on your images. Cool. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create our last tag. Const p equals document.create element p. And then in here, p, oh, let's call this description because I don't like naming things based on their tag. I like being like very explicit to other developers, like, hey, this is the description inside this card. Description that inner text equals cat.description. And then I'm going to take name, image, and description, and then I'm going to append them to the cat card. So remember, the cat card is an element, so I can just go ahead and say cat card dot. This is a little bit goofy, but append works exactly like append child, except it can take multiple arguments. If you're thinking, hey, then why not just use append all the time? You're probably right. Use append all the time. So we can go ahead, you can refresh this now, and we're back to our normal state. Let's take a look at this. A lot of code, right? A lot of code went into that when we could have just done inner HTML. It's essentially more secure, but it also allows us to do a few more new things. Before we get there, right? There are certain things, right, where you're like, okay, classlist.add, I don't remember that. You didn't show me that before. Create element certainly is new. Append, very new. The solution to remembering all of this is not to. Google it. Be like, how to append an element, or how to add an element to the DOM, how to add a class to an element. In order to be really good at Googling, remember the data type that we're dealing with, element or something like that. And we can just go ahead and we can be like, create element JavaScript. And then MDN will be like, well, here's how you do it. Create an element, give it some content, and then add it to the DOM somewhere. They're using insert before, those nerds. But you'll find a bunch of different ways to write JavaScript when you Google this, right? This structure though, where you go ahead and you create it with all of this stuff, is great for a variety of different reasons. For one, these are all now JavaScript objects that I can keep track of. So I can go ahead right here and be like cats equals an empty array, or oops, cats empty array. And now at the back, I could be like dom.cats.push. And I can go ahead and say like cat card. Now, if I do dom.cats again, you'll notice I have 7 cat cards that I just have access to. I can iterate over this. I can do a bunch of different things to it. And because it's JavaScript and everything's an object, right? I can go in here and I can be like cat card, or like cat card dot macavitize equals function image dot source equals, where are we at, /macavity .gif. So you're noticing what I'm doing right here is I'm keeping track of this card that I just created, right? Which we don't have to do. This is just a weird thing that I'm demonstrating that we can do, since we now have this as an object and not just as a random bit of HTML and a larger string of HTML. Now we have this pushed right here. We can put functions on it, and we can do a bunch of cool things. So I can go over here and I can be like dom.cats.first, or let's give me the first one, right? .macavitize. And now it's Macavity. I can do this to the fourth one. Then we go ahead and we see Macavity. Grisabella is now Macavity. Yeah. Once I've got these things stored as objects, right, in JavaScript, there's no end to the behaviors I can give them, what I can make them do. And so that's the real advantage of doing this. And that's why I'm going to end up doing this a whole lot more. Usually when I have like just basic HTML that I want to spit out, I'm going to be using inner HTML. When I want to give something behaviors, when I want to add event listeners, something, when I want to do something like that, I'm at least creating its main element as an object in JavaScript. But both of these ways are fine. How are we feeling? I showed you some crazy stuff at the end when I like pushed these all into an array. And then I like gave them all like functions that we can use. For those of you who are, that was mostly for the people who are repeating, who are like, cool, class orientation. I saw you use this .all, and I want to know how we can use it. When we keep track of things, we can call functions. But all I need you to know for now is that this way and this way are 2 ways to create objects on the DOM. And all I want you to be doing for now is practicing creating objects on the DOM. Cool. I'm going to keep this commented out for fun and for those of you who are repeating. But oops. I'm on a new Windows computer or Windows keyboard on my Mac computer. And so everything's a little bit lies. So that's why I keep messing up my shortcuts today. But in terms of just creating this and adding it to the DOM, how are we feeling? What we did right here, we created one element. We added that to the cats list, right? For each cat card, we're iterating through the cats. creating a cat card, appending it to the list of cats, the cats list, right? Div. And then inside of it, we're appending a name, an image, and a p tag, all of which are new elements right here. How are we feeling with this? Just this part, not the weird thing about giving it methods and doing crazy stuff to it, right? Cool. For the rest of the week, your goal, create elements on the DOM. Read them, query selector them. Try to update them using query selector. And then you can call remove on them. And then you've got CRUD on elements on the DOM. And we like CRUD on anything. Cool. And then next week we get into event listeners, which will mean that instead of you doing it in the console, you can make your users do it for you. Great. Not much to practice, just creating stuff, editing and updating it. Do it whatever website you want, but I want you all to get practice. I want you all to be typing it. Cool. All right. Any last questions? All right. Good luck, everybody. Thank you for letting me take you 10 minutes over.
Thanks.